Hello and welcome to the top custom Hearthstone cards of the week. First up is Trog Elder, 3 mana, 2/3 shaman minion that can be summoned using overloaded mana crystals. So you could use this normally and pay 3 mana to get this 2/3 out on the board, but the real advantage of this card is that if you play an overload card, on your next turn when you overloaded mana crystals, you can instead use those to play Trog Elder. It's a pretty smart concept because on its own 3 mana for a 2/3 isn't that great, but if you're able to use mana crystals that you wouldn't have access to anyways, then it's basically like getting a 2/3 minion for free. I always found it odd that they've been printing a bunch of overload cards for Shaman, but there's still very few overload synergies. The idea with overload is that you get some good value for relatively lower cost, but then on the following turn you end up paying more and the whole cost of the card ends up evening out. Trog Elder would definitely be one way of incentivizing some sort of overload deck, and so if one ever saw play, I think Trog Elder would fit right in. Next up, we have Substitute Creature. I'm glad we have a pun card in this episode. 5 mana 4/4 Shaman Legendary with the battle cry, shuffle 3 homework packs into your opponent's deck. And these homework packs are spells that automatically cast when they're drawn, so they'll draw your opponent a card and overload them for 3. With Substitute Creature, the battle cry is meant to hurt your opponent's curve. And in the Shaman class with cards like Shudderwalk, there are ways where you're going to be able to play this battle cry multiple times and shuffle quite a bit of homework into your opponent's deck. Now, is this actually a viable strategy? Maybe not. Definitely in the current meta where aggro is pretty rampant, being overloaded for 3 isn't that important. But if you think about it, some of the more controlling and definitely the combo decks would have a real problem being overloaded for 3. The difference between having 10 mana and 7 is really painful when you need all of that mana to get a combo off. Substitute Creature would be a really hard card to use in the game right now. I love the idea, but I don't really know in the future when it would be viable. Regardless if it was competitive or not, I think it's a fun idea, and Blizzard should definitely play around with an idea like it. Next up, we have a Bird in the Bush. 5 mana druid spell, choose a friendly minion, choose one, summon a copy of it, or add 2 copies of it to your hand. So, for example, if you have a card like Hadronox out on the board, you could either choose to summon a copy of it, or just add 2 of them to your hand for 5 mana. It's kind of like Mage's Molten Reflection, except it costs 1 more mana, and with the choose one, it has more flexibility where you could instead add value to your own hand. It's really interesting because depending on the minion and on the situation, you may be desperate where you need to just use it to summon another minion, or you might find yourself in a position where you'd rather just have more value and add 2 to your hand. Of course, with Fandral out on the board, you would get both. The thing is, anytime you talk about Druid, you have to worry about all the combos. I talked about Hadronox before, this would be some insane value. On top of that, you also have to watch out for Malygos. Combine this with the Twig and some other cards, and you could end up with a pretty scary OTK. So it's kind of tough because I think on its own, the card definitely works. I don't think it's necessarily too overpowered, but kind of how Druid is set up, I don't think it would be great for the game for this card to be printed. We'll have to see. Next Hearthstone year, a lot of expansions are rotating out, so that could change the meta quite a bit, and Druid as well. So maybe at that point, you could print a card like a Bird in the Bush. Next up is Thin Ice, 1 mana Warlock spell that allows you to give an enemy minion, inspire, destroy this minion. So I always thought the corrupting effect in Warlock was a pretty interesting idea, but it is a really slow effect. And I think similarly, Thin Ice is also a slow effect, but it does play into your opponent having a powerful hero power. Because when you give an enemy minion inspire, destroy itself, then your opponent won't be able to use their hero power unless they also don't mind killing that minion. Now, I will say, actually putting this in your deck wouldn't be very smart. It's a 1 mana card, your opponent can easily play around it, so it's not like you're going to be able to use this on an enemy Lich King. Again, maybe this is more of a deterrent from your opponent using their hero power. Maybe your opponent is forced to just use their hero power because it's either that good of a hero power or they're in a dire situation. I think those instances are pretty rare though, and minions usually don't really last that long on board. It's tough printing a card with this weak of an effect, but it would be interesting if this was some sort of minion battle cry. Thin Ice brings an interesting idea, but it's ultimately too situational and just not powerful enough for it to actually see play. Next up is Patient Observer, 6 mana, 6/6 neutral minion, where if you have less than 6 mana crystals when you draw this, shuffle it back into the deck, and draw a card. So the idea with this card is that you're never going to draw it when you can't play it. And that's really good for a tempo deck, because instead of drawing a 6-drop on turn 4 that you can't even play, this will go back into your deck and draw you another minion that you might be able to play. Someone in the comments mentioned some sort of combo where if you emptied out your deck and then played Baleful Banker on this card and then played Mojo Master Zihi and then drew a card, you could basically infinitely draw Patient Observer and not be able to play it and then put it back into your deck. And it's just a ridiculous combo I wanted to mention that Blizzard probably wouldn't realize, and it would end up breaking the game. While the idea of this card is really great, it doesn't really bring that much more value to the table, at least not enough for it to be worth playing. Maybe if you gave this card a better stat line or some other effect, it could see play, but with the overall design, I think the idea is great. And next up, we have Underdog Story, 2-mana warrior spell where you draw a card and overkill win the game instead of losing. It's 2 mana to draw a card, which is boring if you just use it for card draw, but if you're low on health and you're in fatigue and you draw a card that would normally kill you, the overkill activates and you actually win the game instead of losing. An interesting game plan would be to draw as quickly as you can, actually get really low on health without your opponent being able to kill you, and then cast this spell to draw enough fatigue damage to kill yourself. That would be a crazy sort of gameplay where it's kind of like the opposite of a fatigue deck. In fact, it's almost like a Togwaggle deck, except you don't play Togwaggle and switch your deck with your opponent. While I think this is a really interesting card and a creative use of overkill, ultimately, I would hate this card. Basically, this enables a type of gameplay where you're just trying to draw your deck as quickly as possible. Your opponent doesn't really have any sort of win condition to try to combat this card. They just have to try to kill you before you draw your entire deck, or catch you off guard. Again, it's a really creative card, but I wouldn't want it for the game. Next up is Fireworks Technician, 4 mana, 2/8 neutral minion. With the battle cry, choose an enemy minion, deal 8 damage, randomly split between it and this minion. This card is all over the place. For 4 mana, you're able to deal 8 damage, which could remove a pretty big minion. But most likely, you're gonna deal, on average, about 4 damage to a minion and get yourself a 2/4. And honestly, I think that's a pretty decent card. 4 mana for a 2/4 isn't great, but dealing 4 damage can remove some pretty serious minions. But of course, with any randomly dealt damage, things can go bad. For 4 mana, you could get 0/0 if all 8 damage went into this minion. I think cards like this that randomly deal damage are fine in the game. And the fact that you can choose an enemy minion and maybe prioritize one that you definitely want to try to remove that turn, it allows you to control the randomness much more. But I think dealing 8 damage, even if half of it goes into this minion, might actually be too powerful for this card. Sometimes you'll see the random damaging minions in Arena, but in standard play they usually just aren't good enough to actually see play. I don't want this sort of randomness deciding standard ladder games. I think this opinion of the card is just subjective. If you don't mind this type of random damage on standard ladder, then maybe you would enjoy this card being in the game. Personally, I like more experienced Firework Technicians. And last up is Oil of the Advanced One. 9 mana, 9/9 neutral minion. While in your hand, if you have 6 mechs out on the board, this instead transforms into the Advanced One, which is a 9 mana, 30/30 mech with magnetic. Now here's the thing you have to consider with this card. Likely, you'll have to have 6 mechs out on the board survive until you can play the Advanced One. At 9 mana, you aren't going to have a lot of room to work with, where you're going to be able to play mechs on the turn that you play the Advanced One. But it starts to get a little worrisome when you talk about Galvanizer, because if you're able to play 2 of those and get some minions cheaper, you could actually play them on the same turn that you play the Advanced One. Now, if you just have 3 mechs survive out on the board, on that next turn, you can play 3 mechs and then play the Ancient One, magnetized to one of the minions that can already attack, and probably kill your opponent. This is obviously a take on the Ancient One, and this one requires a lot of preparation as well, but the fact that it has magnetic means that you can instantly deal that 30 damage. And so it turns a really big minion into an OTK. Opponents could definitely try to deal with this card by removing enemy mechs. And I'm not saying it would be easy to get Galvanizer to hit on a lot of minions so that you could play it on the same turn as the Advanced One, but I'm also just not that big of a fan of these OTK type of decks. Let me know if you think a viable deck with this sort of OTK would actually work. Well, those are all of the cards for this week. Thank you to all of the card creators, and thank you for watching the video. If you haven't seen it yet, I made another humorous cards that could actually work in Hearthstone, and the last episode of the top custom Hearthstone cards of the week. That's all for now, and until next time, ta-ta.